This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You're going to need a bigger basket this Easter. Hop over to Fresh Time Market for your Easter essentials, like delicious hams, cage-free eggs by the dozen, local cheeses, and more. Fresh Time makes your Sunday extra special with the quality ingredients you need for a scrumptious Easter brunch. So place all the eggs and everything else you need in a Fresh Time basket. The Easter Bunny will thank you, and so will everybody else at your gathering. See you soon at your neighborhood Fresh Time Market.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 526, Operation Neptune. Last time, with Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil saved, it was time for the Soviets to make their next move, for clearly, they were the ones with the initiative. As their next target was General Ruoff's 17th Army, trapped on the Taman Peninsula, a two-pronged attack was carried out, or rather attempted. The landward attack had not yet advanced as hoped, and the southern amphibious attack was screwed up 6 ways from Sunday. Still, a toehold had been established, just south of the main port city of Novorossiysk at Stanichka. Now, it was a race. Could the Axis wipe out the small enclave before the Soviets reinforced it? The man in charge of this toehold was Major Caesar Konikov. He and his 250 men had come ashore during the attack, but their part was supposed to end in all of their deaths. It was to have been a distraction, nothing more. So the men were lightly armed, no sense in wasting equipment, but that's not how it worked out. Konikov had already seen several engagements, and his men revered him. In fact, the 250 men with him were all volunteers. They wanted to die with Konikov. When this force landed, their job was simple: get the attention of the enemy, be attacked, fight back as long as they could, and then die. To help get the attention of the enemy, before Kunikov's force landed, the nearest enemy units were attacked with naval bombardment and air attacks. Still, the Germans and Romanians were ready for them when they came ashore. The fighting had been intense, and at times, hand-to-hand. Kunikov was wounded twice, but he stayed in command. Eventually, a small section of the shoreline was theirs, which is when Kunikov radioed in their status. In response, a force that was to have gone to the main landing was sent to Kunikov. He now had 800 men, so he told them to advance right away. No sense in letting the Germans regroup. This force moved out, captured a German artillery battery, which opened up a way to the village of Stanichka. Soon, a section 4 kilometers wide and 2.5 kilometers deep was theirs. But as we have seen, Kunikov's was the only success of Operation C. The rest had been captured, or killed, or managed to escape. But remembering that failure was normally accompanied by a bullet, the Soviet command here decided to build on Kunikov's local success. As the next few days went by, more reinforcements were sent in. But this was not the time to advance. No, the Soviets had come to respect the Germans' ability to fight, but more importantly, to exploit the mistakes of their enemy. So, leaning on the Shakespeare's, "In case of defense, 'tis best to weigh the enemy more mighty than he seems," Kunikov's force stayed where it was and focused on preparing the shoreline to receive even more reinforcements and supplies, as well as being better prepared to evacuate the wounded. In fact, everything was going rather well, though this incursion had not been planned, that is until February 12th. When on patrol, Major Kunikov stepped on a German mine. It detonated, injuring the man in his groin. Speaking of all the work his men had been doing, had they had more time to set up proper medical facilities, he might have been treated then and there. Instead, he was evacuated out 2 days later, but gangrene had set in by then. Kunikov died on February 14th, just before reaching the nearest hospital. He was made a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military recognition in the country. As for the war, it went on, undisturbed. With Kunikov dead, command fell to Colonel A.S. Potapov, who had been, it has to be said, in command of the troops that had failed at Ozieka. Not that Potapov would have to worry about his leadership skills. As the 255th and 83rd Naval Infantry Brigades, along with the 165th Infantry Brigades, came ashore, a General Gordeyev arrived, and he was now in command. Much of this change of leadership had taken place during Kunikov's last few days. So by February 10th, Gordeyev used the reinforcements to take the rest of the village of Stanichka and then the southern section of Novorossiysk. And given the limited access forces who weren't able to fight for the most southern part of this area, soon the Soviets had a 34-kilometer wide and 7-kilometer deep area under their control. To be sure, the Germans and Romanians had been attacking this growing bulge of enemy-controlled territory, but all attempts had failed. By February 15th, reinforcements were still coming ashore. Soon, General Gordeyev had 17,000 men, 95 pieces of artillery, and 850 machine guns. Proudly, this was being called the Little Land by those who had first come ashore with Kunikov. Of course, it wasn't so little now. During the Soviet expansion, there were clashes with the Axis powers nearby. As they, the Axis, were on a rise near the bay, they could see the enemy bringing in more of everything, so they started shelling the process. The Soviets, in reaction, started bringing in men and equipment at night, leaving the fighting to the daylight hours. Still, the Soviets held what they had and kept expanding. The days went by, seeing that a direct attack was not going to shift the unwelcome Soviets. The Germans added to their artillery attacks air attacks on a daily basis. The idea was, if we can't shift them, then we can make them so weak that they will be useless as a fighting force, the second best scenario for the Axis. However, late February and March were dominated by foul weather, preventing any serious large-scale attacks by either side.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, my name is Matt.
And I'm McKinley. We are the father-son team that brings you History Dispatches.
History Dispatches is a short daily history show where we talk about topics from all over the world and all throughout history. We talk about people, places, events, and even objects.
While anything is fair game, we have a soft spot for the weird, the wacky, and the obscure things you may have never even heard of.
Do you have any examples?
How about Wojtek, the bear who rose to the rank of corporal in the Polish army? Or the Great Emu War? Or how about the biggest treasure take in the history of piracy?
That sounds cool, but do you have a story about the head of Oliver Cromwell? Or one about the ancient library of Alexandria? And a story about the first woman to climb Mount Everest would be cool.
Well, we got those as well. Every weekday, there's something new and fun.
Sweet. So how do I get this trove of goodness?
All you have to do is go to historydispatches.com or just look for History Dispatches in your favorite podcast app.
When the Germans figured out that enemy supplies and reinforcements were coming in at night, they used their artillery and aircraft against the ships coming in. Among the supplies was wood to build bunkers and to reinforce the trenches. But even when a transport ship was hit, the stolid Soviets simply gathered up the wood that was still floating and brought it ashore. Or if a ship hit a German mine dropped from a plane, the survivors would shoot off rockets, a prearranged signal, and rescue craft would seek them out. It was methodical. It was unstoppable. And the Germans and Romanians did not like the numbers building up to their south. In April, with the weather improving, the Germans put together Operation Neptune, an attack that would drive the enemy away. But this called for several good days of weather, which was not happening. However, in preparation, additional aircraft was transferred to the Donbass and southern Ukraine areas to reinforce Luftwaffe's numbers. The plan was for the German air attacks to suppress the enemy's artillery to the south and east of the main port city. Then 3 German divisions would push their way south. To make the Soviets more relaxed in their defense, a rumor was put out that the Germans and Romanians were going to pull back from the port city as it was untenable to defend it. And the attack that really was coming would not have the normal pre-artillery shelling to maximize surprise. General Ruoff of the 17th Army wanted the 4th Mountain and 125th Infantry Divisions to surge ahead to get as far southeast as they could. Then the still fresh 73rd Division would take up the fight. The idea was to reach the coastline. By then, the enemy would be fractured into many small parts, which could then be destroyed piecemeal. Their goal was to reach Stanichka. The jump-off point was to be on April 6th, but the weather was still uncooperative, so this was pushed back to April 10th. Neptune was eventually launched on April 17th at 6:30 a.m., but fog would not allow air activity. Relative to the Soviet-controlled territory, the attack would not so much come from directly north, but rather from the northwest. The Germans were situated thusly. The 73rd Infantry Division was the most northern unit. Below them was the 125th Division, and closest to the coast was the 4th Mountain Division. The 4th Mountain Division went in and got past the enemy's outermost lines. They surged ahead for about 1.5 kilometers, but then were held up by strong resistance. Next, the 125th Division in the middle went in and again overran the outermost lines in front of them. Despite the weather, German artillery on the eastern shore of Semes Bay started up that afternoon. But the Soviets had already brought up reinforcements, not trusting the rumor of the enemy pulling back. The 125th advanced for about 1 kilometer. Then those reinforcements engaged them and stopped them cold. The Germans started taking heavy losses. The fighting raged throughout the day. General Ruoff was tempted to move some of the men of the 73rd to help the men of the 125th, but that movement would take too long, and it would mean that those men would not get rest before the next day. The 125th would have to make do. The fighting started up again the next day, April 18th, at 5:30 a.m. All German guns within range fired at a specific point, trying to punch a hole in the Soviet line. But the Soviet 83rd Marine Infantry Brigade, which had been a part of the original landing and was now resting in the rear, was sent forward the night before. The men of the German 125th broke through the line that had stopped them the day before, just south of the Poklaba farm. See the map. And sensing that this was going to work, General Ruoff had the 73rd and the 4th Mountain offer up harassment fire to tie down the Soviet forces closest to them. But if the 125th's activities forced the enemy to pull units from other areas, then those other 2 divisions would move out. Alas, the 125th was soon stalled, and the Soviets did not fall for it. The next day, April 19th, the Soviets stole a march by counterattacking before the Germans were even ready to move out. Or rather, the Russians launched several counterattacks that day, though the first was presaged by heavy artillery and mortar fire. The Germans held their ground and at 11:20 a.m. advanced themselves. The goal was to link up with a unit that had made the most gains. And though it took 7 hours of fighting, the link-up was made. Finally, progress. But just after the link-up, seeing what was happening, the Soviets launched several counterattacks against this, forcing the Germans to then go on the defensive. Soviet artillery attacks from the south and from the east of this link-up helped with this. German troops would later say it was the heaviest artillery attack they had ever experienced in the war. As night came, the Germans tried to get some sleep, but the Soviets kept attacking throughout the night of April 19th. After first light of the 20th, the 125th tried to advance, but gaining only a few hundred meters, again, they were brought up short. The local German headquarters figured out that not only was the 125th not going to be able to advance, but that Soviet artillery attacks was bleeding these men to a dangerous degree. It was decided by the commanding general that no further attacks would be made until April 22nd, until reserve units could be brought forward. But just as the Germans realized this, that they were very short on reserves, General Kurt Zeitzler, the chief of the Army General Staff, demanded a report from the 125th and 4th Mountain Divisions. The report said that not only was there a shortage of NCOs, non-commissioned officers, the backbone of the Army, but there was a distinct lack of training since early 1942, as the men were rushed to the Eastern Front. Just as bad, the report read that they had lost air dominance, as the enemy had brought forward another air corps, thus having more planes to throw into the mix.
As a long-time foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places. Nowhere as important to the world as China. But these days, few journalists are able to get the inside story. That's because China has shut the door to much of the media.
Authorities have far more efficient tools to control the press, and they're far less reluctant to use them.
I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the U.S. versus China, we're trying to break through. We'll talk about Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
On April 22nd, the supposed day of the renewed German offensive, a report from the German command there to Zeitzler said another offensive was not possible, given the lack of reserves, Soviet air dominance, and the enemy's ability to continually bring in more men by sea. The report ended with, of the 57,590 men they had, only 13,541 of them were available for this attack. It was simply not enough. Field Marshal von Kleist of Army Group A flew in on April 23rd. He assessed the situation, and Operation Neptune was called off 2 days later. As for the plan really, to build a grand road and railway bridge across the Kerch Strait to help send in men from Crimea, that would not be complete until August of 1944. As the days turned into weeks, the number of dogfights over the bay grew. In time, the Soviets completely dominated the skies, but more from quantity than quality. Having said that, the Russian pilots who survived were getting the measure of the Luftwaffe airmen. With more men and supplies still coming in, the Soviet trench lines started heading north. Soon, they were close enough to the access trenches to occasionally throw grenades at each other. Soviet aircraft started strafing the closest enemy lines, but just to make sure that they were not accidentally hitting their own men, the Soviets closest to the Germans would hang their white undershirts on their lines and then send word to their comrade pilots, "White is us, don't shoot at us." As had happened in Stalingrad, the Axis troops were shocked that the proximity of Russian troops was not a deterrent to the Soviet artillery or air attacks. Sadly, as more of the Soviet pilots were rushed to the front, they were not equipped with safety vests. So should a plane be damaged or brought down and land in the water, if they were injured, many of those men drowned. During the night, infantrymen on both sides and the Soviet naval brigades tried to rest. The night was for the engineers. Punching the time clock when it became dark, these two sides sent their engineers out to repair the barbed wire fences or try to destroy the fences of the enemy. This led to clashes and at times contests of very large numbers of men. And trying to help their comrades, the Germans would send up flares or activate their searchlights. Those night clashes became eerily lit battles. Still, the Soviets strengthened their positions. The weeks became months as there was large-scale operations in other areas that summer of 1943. But the German 17th Army was never far from the Stavka's thoughts. To force the enemy to retreat back to Crimea was eventually possible, they knew. But to destroy it outright, that was the real goal. After the war, the future Soviet Premier, Brezhnev, wrote a book called The Little Land. It's true that he was a commissar and he had the rank of colonel, but the claims that he made that he was in the thick of it is a little hard to believe. Certainly some of those who had participated in it quietly said his claims were less than accurate. Either way, the name Little Land had stuck. And though it was not so little anymore, the Germans regularly sent attacks south to drive the now quite large beachhead back into the Black Sea. But it was Moscow, November 1941, all over again. The Soviets would no be moved. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, I'm going to need another episode or so, but we'll get this done, and obviously it's wrapping up soon. But again, when you can't stop the enemy from reinforcing, I mean, you're going to lose. The who, where, when, why details don't matter. You're eventually going to lose if you can't stop them, from reinforcing. Anyway, so that's the, and I'm sure you noticed in there, so not only can they not stop the Soviets, but the Germans are getting to the point where, like, oh my God, we suddenly don't have enough men to fill all the gaps from the, that we lost during combat. That's another recipe for eventual disaster when you can't replace the losses. And the people that normally you bring up aren't as good or as experienced as the guys who were already there. So again, these things are starting to dovetail very badly for the invaders. We'll see how it unfolds. Anyways, so let's see here. I have two enthusiastic guys. Let's see if I can do this right. So as far as my latest members, Nick Justo from Seven Hills, Queensland in Australia. Thank you very much, Nick. And he donated. So if I ever have another son, Nick, don't hold your breath. Also, there's Mark. I'm not sure if it's Sasser or Casser from Melbourne, Australia. I was in Melbourne years ago. I loved it. Amazing city. Anyway, but he became a member and he donated. Okay, so if I have another son, his name will be Nikki J. Sasser Harris. I don't know. I'll blend the two names together. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so for something a lot less fun, and I will make this short and sweet. To make a very long story short, the podcast industry has changed over the last couple of years. There was a point about 4 years ago when I was making pretty good money and I had no stress. Now, even though I'm putting out more episodes than ever before, as you can tell, doing 2 a week, which I've never done before, they just don't pay as much on the ads. I know the ads are, they're ads, but it's just not as much as it used to. And so I'm struggling here. So at any point, and I know this is tacky and I apologize, but desperate times, that kind of stuff. If ever you've enjoyed this podcast or whatever, any donation that you can make would be greatly appreciated because it is getting to a scary point. I would never stop doing the podcast, but it would fall back to a hobby the way it started. And again, you don't want to hear this, and I know, but I don't know what to do. So it's just getting, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. So if you have other podcasts that you really love that you don't want to go anywhere, maybe you consider a small donation, whatever. So there, I said it. I'm just putting that out in the universe. I hate doing that, but I'm a little freaked out. Anyway, so we'll keep the story going, and then we'll see what happens after the combat here. Maybe we'll see what's going on with Rostov, Rzhev, Leningrad as well. And then I do want to spend some time on this because I promised that I would, and I am enjoying it. We're covering new material. I'm learning a lot, the details, but I am super excited about bringing the North Americans in, Morocco, where they landed at 3 or 4 places in North Africa. Anyway, I can't wait to bring them in. That will definitely happen before this calendar year is over, so we have that to look forward to. So, okay, sorry for yapping on like this. As always, take care, everyone.
At the International Spy Museum, we often get the inside scoop on little-known stories from the shadow world.
There's this underground spy war on American campuses.
But here's a secret. You don't have to visit the museum to hear these stories.
These are the most consequential discussions and decisions you will have in your career.
Tune in wherever you get your podcasts every Tuesday and discover how global intelligence shapes our everyday lives.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared Bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.